Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're tackling perhaps the most enduring, most debated question in all of history. The real reason the Roman Empire fell. The Western Roman Empire, the colossal political and military structure that dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries, effectively dissolved in 476 CE. But to say it fell is an oversimplification. This was not a sudden collapse like a building imploding. It was a slow, agonizing process of decline, decay, and transformation that spanned hundreds of years. The narrative is complex, with historians proposing everything from lead poisoning to Christianity, from military overstretch to climate change. To truly understand this seismic shift in world history, we must move beyond any single, easy answer and explore the confluence of factors military, economic, environmental, and ideological that brought the greatest empire of the ancient world to its knees. I've immersed myself in the works of giants in the field to bring you this definitive analysis. We begin with the foundational work of Edward Gibbon, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire *, which lays out the classic theory of internal decay. We then contrast that with the modern material perspective of Bryan, Ward-Perkins, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization *, who argues for a catastrophic end. We'll examine the groundbreaking scientific data presented by Harper, The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire *, which introduces climate and plague as central players. And finally, we ground our discussion in the rich, contemporary understanding provided by Mary Beard's SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome *. Our deep dive will explore 6 critical phases of this decline. Settle in, because by the end of this extensive video you'll have a profound understanding of the real reason the Roman Empire fell. Our journey begins with the classic interpretation, the narrative that dominated historical thought for centuries, laid out by Edward Gibbon in the 18th century. Gibbon, writing during the Enlightenment, believed the decline was primarily the result of internal decay. His central thesis, as encapsulated in his monumental work, argued that the Roman Empire suffered a gradual loss of civic virtue and military spirit, ultimately collapsing under its own immense weight and luxury. He famously attributed the final catastrophe to the triumph of barbarism and religion. For Gibbon, the Pax Romana, the 2 centuries of peace and prosperity beginning with Augustus, was the zenith of human happiness. The decline began not with external enemies, but with the emperors who followed the Antonines, men who eroded the foundational republican values and introduced despotism. Gibbon saw the rise of Christianity as a debilitating factor, arguing that it shifted the focus of the populace from the duties of the state and military service to the pursuit of salvation and spiritual life. This, he believed, resulted in a weakening of the martial spirit that had originally forged the empire. Furthermore, Gibbon highlighted the corruption of the elite and the decay of the Senate's power, leading to an unstable political system where emperors were frequently made and unmade by the Praetorian Guard or ambitious provincial armies. This political instability, the period of the barracks emperors, drained the empire's resources and talent. While modern historians, including Mary Beard in SPQR*, often critique Gibbon's anti-Christian bias and his overly simplistic view of virtue, his insight into the corrosive effect of internal political instability and economic extravagance remains foundational. The constant civil wars of the 3rd century, where over 20 legitimate emperors reigned in 50 years, shattered the political system, devalued the currency, and forced the empire to divert vast resources away from defending its frontiers. Gibbon's narrative emphasizes that Rome's demise was less about being conquered and more about a slow, self-inflicted wound, a testament to the idea that civilizations fall when they lose faith in the values that built them. This moral and institutional decay created the vulnerabilities that later external forces would so easily exploit. It provides the essential philosophical starting point for understanding the empire's vulnerability to other threats. Moving beyond Gibbon's internal focus, the second, and most immediate, cause of the Western Empire's collapse was undeniably the military dilemma, the transformation of the Roman army and the catastrophic failure to manage the barbarian migrations. The military machine was the heart of the empire. When it failed, the empire was doomed. Mary Beard notes that the Roman army was a fundamentally flexible, evolving entity, capable of absorbing people from the frontiers, but this system came under immense pressure. By the 4th century, the cost of maintaining the vast legions had become astronomical, consuming the vast majority of the imperial budget. This heavy expense led to increased taxation, which in turn stifled the economy and drove many citizens into poverty or into the service of powerful local magnates. further undermining central authority. The composition of the army also fundamentally changed. To fill the ranks, the Romans increasingly relied on foederati, federated barbarian troops hired to defend the borders in exchange for land and payments. These forces, loyal to their own chiefs rather than to Rome, became a double-edged sword. While they defended the empire, their leaders, often barbarian generals like Stilicho and Ricimer, held the real power behind the imperial throne, a state of affairs Gibbon viewed with deep skepticism. The critical turning point was the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where the Gothic cavalry annihilated the Eastern Roman field army and killed Emperor Valens. This defeat, as Ward-Perkins argues, permanently shattered the myth of Roman military invincibility and forced Rome to accommodate the Goths within its borders, demonstrating that the frontier was now porous and the internal lands vulnerable. From that point on, the migrations of the Huns under Attila, pushing various Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, Suebi westward, created an unstoppable domino effect. The crossing of the Rhine in 406 CE by large numbers of Germanic tribes, a moment of profound significance, signaled the inability of Rome to defend its core territories. The subsequent sack of Rome by the Visigoths under Alaric in 410 CE, though militarily not fatal, was a devastating psychological blow. The Eternal City had been violated, a shock felt across the entire Mediterranean world. By the mid-5th century, provinces like Britain, Spain, and North Africa were no longer under effective imperial control, having been carved up by the Visigoths and the Vandals. The Vandals' seizure of North Africa, in particular, was catastrophic as it cut off Rome's vital grain supply, crippling the imperial economy. The military's inability to simultaneously manage a professional defense, suppress internal civil wars, and effectively integrate or subdue the mass of migrating peoples was a systemic failure. The army became less a Roman force and more a collection of mercenary bands, loyal only to the highest bidder or the most successful general. This transformation, driven by cost and manpower shortages, was the direct instrument of the Western Empire's fragmentation and is crucial to understanding how external pressure became an internal, unmanageable crisis. Next, we must consider the pervasive and often invisible forces of economic collapse and institutional rot that eroded the foundation of Roman life. As Bryan Ward-Perkins argues forcefully, the end of the Roman Empire was indeed a fall that led to the end of a sophisticated civilization, a catastrophe characterized by economic breakdown and a drastic simplification of life. The roots of the economic problem lay in the unsustainability of the imperial system itself, particularly after the Pax Romana. The empire was built on conquest, which provided cheap labor, slaves, and vast amounts of tribute gold and silver. When the expansion stopped in the 2nd century, the influx of wealth slowed, but the expenses of the enormous army and the luxurious imperial court only grew. This created a permanent fiscal crisis. To meet these costs, emperors resorted to two ruinous measures. First, debasing the coinage, which meant reducing the precious metal content of coins and replacing it with cheaper base metals. This led to galloping inflation, decimating trade, destroying the middle class's savings, and forcing the economy to regress to a clumsy system of barter and payment in kind. Gibbon details the chaotic results of this instability, which undermined the very faith people had in the state. Second, the state resorted to punitive taxation. As the currency became worthless, taxes were often demanded in kind, grain, supplies, or military recruits, putting an unbearable strain on the peasantry and landowners. Many smaller farmers abandoned their land and sought protection from powerful local magnates, ceding their independence and contributing to the rise of localized, feudal power structures that bypassed central imperial authority. This institutional rot was manifest in the growth of bureaucracy. As the empire became more centralized under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, the number of officials, tax collectors, and administrators exploded. This vast, often corrupt, bureaucratic machine was designed to extract every last resource to feed the army and the court, but it became an end in itself, draining wealth without increasing productivity. Mary Beard highlights the shift away from a citizen-led republic to a highly centralized, command economy run by the military and bureaucrats. The breakdown of infrastructure, particularly the famous Roman roads and aqueducts, followed. As cities shrank and trade routes became dangerous due to banditry and local conflict, the elaborate interregional economy of the Roman world disintegrated. Ward-Perkins provides chilling archaeological evidence of this fall. The sudden drop in pottery production and distribution, the cessation of complex water and sewage systems in formerly thriving cities, and the retreat from high-quality stone and brick construction back to rudimentary wooden buildings. This regression proved that the fall was not merely a political event, but a severe degradation of the material conditions of life driven by the unsustainable fiscal and institutional policies that bled the empire dry over centuries. In a truly modern and increasingly accepted interpretation, the fourth reason for the empire's demise introduces forces entirely beyond Rome's control: climate change, disease, and the environmental shock. This argument, championed by Harper in The Fate of Rome uses scientific data from tree rings, ice cores, and genomics to show that the Roman world was struck by two devastating, successive catastrophes: a shift in climate and a series of lethal pandemics. Harper identifies the Roman climate optimum c. 200 BCE 150 c, a period of warm, stable, and wet weather as a key factor in the empire's success, allowing for massive agricultural yields and population growth. The economic stability and population boom that defined the Pax Romana were, in part, a gift of good weather. However, this period was followed by a shift toward a colder, more unstable climate, leading to crop failures, famines, and increased pressure on resource distribution, a significant blow to a system already stressed by high taxes and inflation. More devastating was the introduction of disease. The Roman Empire, through its complex trade networks and efficient roads, created the first truly connected global economy, which, tragically, made it a perfect incubator for widespread pandemics. The Antonine Plague c. 165-180 c, possibly smallpox, ripped through the empire, killing millions and severely depleting the army's ranks and the tax base. This demographic shock marks a critical turning point, crippling the empire's ability to maintain its borders and finance its operations just as external pressures were mounting. This was followed in the 3rd century by the Plague of Cyprian, an even more virulent pandemic that further destabilized the political system, contributing to the chaos of the barracks emperors. And finally, the Justinianic Plague c. 541-549 c, the first recorded instance of the bubonic plague, devastated the Eastern Empire under Justinian, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people. While this last one primarily struck the East and came after the Western Empire had formally dissolved, it demonstrates the vulnerability of the Roman system to disease. Harper's work demonstrates that these successive plagues severely undermine the empire's demographic potential. Fewer people meant fewer soldiers, fewer farmers, and a smaller tax base. The environmental and disease shocks acted as an external, uncontrollable force that repeatedly knocked the empire off balance, making it impossible for the already failing political and economic institutions to recover. The plagues did not merely kill people. They broke the confidence of the populace, contributing to the rise of new religious movements, and made the defense of the massive borders untenable, thus acting as a powerful, non-human explanation for the empire's decline. Now we turn to the crucial split between the Western and Eastern Roman empires, a divergence in fate that provides key evidence for the internal causes of the Western collapse. The Western Empire fell. The Eastern Empire Byzantium survived for another 1,000 years. This fact alone suggests that the empire's troubles were regional, not universal, and highlights the relative success of the East's administrative and economic structures. The division began with Diocletian's Tetrarchy in the late 3rd century and was cemented by Constantine's founding of Constantinople, New Rome, in 330 CE. The Western Empire faced a fundamentally worse geographical and strategic situation. It was primarily Latin-speaking, less urbanized, and less wealthy than the Greek-speaking East. Its wealth was concentrated in large, often inefficient, landed estates, whereas the East had a dynamic, commercial, and highly urbanized economy centered on trade routes to Asia. Crucially, the military pressure was overwhelmingly concentrated on the West. The major migratory routes of the Goths, Vandals, Huns, and others lay along the Danube and Rhine frontiers, directly threatening Italy, Gaul, and Spain. The Eastern Empire, protected by the formidable walls of Constantinople and having better internal communication, proved better able to repel, divert, or buy off barbarian threats, often paying the invaders to turn west. Ward-Perkins argues that the East was simply luckier in terms of geography. Furthermore, the Eastern government proved to be fiscally more competent and flexible. They maintained a sound gold coinage, the solid as for centuries, which provided economic stability and maintained the confidence of merchants and traders. The taxes collected in the East could actually be used to pay the army and maintain infrastructure, unlike the increasingly worthless coinage of the West. The West, by contrast, suffered from a persistent crisis of leadership. Its emperors were often puppets of barbarian generals, constantly moving their capitals from Rome to less defensible cities like Ravenna or Milan. Mary Beard emphasizes that Constantinople became a political and cultural powerhouse, a new, self-confident center of the Roman world, while the West's government became increasingly dysfunctional and geographically marginalized. The East's ability to stabilize its economy, maintain central authority, and successfully divert or assimilate barbarian groups ensured its survival, while the Western Empire, lacking the wealth, the defensible capital, and the political stability, simply fractured under the overwhelming military pressure. The survival of the East for a millennium, which remained Roman in its self-conception, shows that the core imperial idea was not inherently flawed, but that the Western half was uniquely and catastrophically vulnerable to the economic, military, and environmental crises that struck in the 4th and 5th centuries. Finally, we arrive at the catastrophe of the 5th century and the traditional end date of 476 CE, the culmination of all the preceding failures. By the beginning of the 5th century, the Western Empire was already a state in name only. As John Toland details, large swaths of the Empire Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were effectively independent kingdoms ruled by various Germanic tribes: Visigoths, Vandals, Franks. The imperial court in Ravenna controlled little more than Italy. The decisive event, often cited as the fall, occurred in 476 CE when the barbarian general Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, the young Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown and robes, to Constantinople, effectively acknowledging the Eastern Emperor Zeno as the sole Roman emperor. He then simply ruled Italy as a king, or more accurately, as Zeno's viceroy. Gibbon's famous line that the empire fell with scarcely a struggle is rooted in this event, highlighting the anticlimax of the end. The people living at the time barely noticed the event, as the central government had long ceased to provide meaningful services or security. The collapse was so slow that the final political act was largely symbolic. However, Bryan Ward-Perkins vehemently argues that this was indeed a catastrophe for the Roman populace. He argues against the revisionist view that the change was merely a transformation or a benign evolution. Archaeological and historical evidence shows a dramatic decline in literacy, trade, complex manufacturing, and state organization. The sophisticated legal and administrative structures that defined Roman life disappeared, replaced by less efficient, more localized forms of governance under the new Germanic kings. The economic and cultural unity of the Roman world was irrevocably shattered. The infrastructure of roads, aqueducts, and public buildings decayed rapidly. The Western Empire was replaced by a series of successor states: the Visigothic Spain, Vandalic North Africa, Ostrogothic Italy, and Frankish Gaul, all ruled by Germanic warrior elites who adopted Roman customs and law to varying degrees, but whose primary loyalty was to their own people, not to the continuity of the Roman state. The final act was not a glorious final battle, but the slow sputtering out of central authority, which had been rendered irrelevant by centuries of political instability, economic chaos, military failure, and demographic collapse. The date 476 CE marks the political reality that there was no longer any emperor ruling the West, and that was inevitable because the empire's core components, the central fisc, the professional army, and the common Roman identity, had all dissolved, confirming that the decline was indeed a multi-century, unavoidable process. In conclusion, to answer the real reason the Roman Empire fell, we must reject the simplistic idea of a single cause and embrace the reality of a complex, multi-layered crisis. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not an assassination, but a prolonged, systemic, and multifaceted illness. Gibbon identified the internal disease of civic decay and political instability, which made the empire weak from within. This vulnerability was then exploited by the military crisis, the overwhelming pressure of barbarian migrations, which the overstretched and increasingly unreliable Roman army could no longer contain. This military and political chaos was exacerbated by a crippling economic and institutional rot, marked by runaway inflation, unsustainable taxation, and the breakdown of sophisticated infrastructure as documented by Ward-Perkins. And finally, the entire process was severely amplified by uncontrollable environmental shocks, including devastating climate change and lethal pandemics like the Antonine and Cyprian plagues, which severely depleted the population and tax base, as evidenced by Harper's research. The Western Empire fell because it lacked the wealth, the defensible geography, and the political stability of the East Byzantium to withstand the confluence of all these catastrophic pressures simultaneously. It was a centuries-long death by 1,000 cuts, a loss of will, a loss of coin, a loss of health, and ultimately, a loss of control. The end was, as Ward-Perkins argues, a true civilizational catastrophe for the people of the West, marking the definitive violent end of the ancient world and the beginning of the medieval period. The legacy of Rome is not in its fall, but in the power of the idea of Rome, which survived in the East and in the fragmented kingdoms of the West, continuing to shape law, language, and culture for millennia. Thank you so much for joining me on this profound exploration of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. This topic demands a thorough examination, and I hope this video, informed by the brilliant works of Gibbon, Ward-Perkins, Harper, and Beard, has provided that clarity. If this deep dive into the complex history of Rome has given you a new perspective, please do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Your support helps us continue to produce more nuanced and thoroughly researched historical content like this. I'm incredibly keen to hear your thoughts. Which of the 6 phases, political decay, military failure, economic rot, environmental shock, the East/West split, or the final collapse, do you find the most critical in explaining the empire's end? Drop your comments and questions down below. I read as many as I can, and I always appreciate your insights and engaging discussion. And before you go, don't forget to check out the description for links to the incredible books we discussed today, as well as other related videos that might deepen your understanding of this pivotal period in history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. This is Facts of Wars, and I'll see you in the next video.